Welcome, and thank you for joining our webinar today, 5 third-party risk management recommendations to prepare for what's next, featuring Prevalent's very own Vice President of Third-Party Risk, Brenda Ferraro. My name is Peter Schumacher. I'll be your webinar host for the day. I've got a couple housekeeping items to cover before we officially get started. So first of all, this is a reminder that all attendee lines are muted. However, in an effort to keep this session interactive, we invite you to submit your questions using the Zoom console. Time permitting, we'll get to those Q&A questions and answers at the end of the session, at the end of the hour. Today's webinar is being recorded. In the next day or so, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to that recording. So I know you didn't join today to hear me, so at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Brenda. Thanks so much for joining us today, and please take it away.
Thank you, Peter. I'm really looking forward to sharing how emerging stronger in today's new threat landscape is something that we're all hoping to achieve. And many of the techniques that we use today are changing because we're living and working differently, as well as we're focusing on different risks to adapt to the new third-party ecosystem and the requirements. So you don't want to stay on this screen. Let's get started, and we'll start talking about all of these things that we can work on moving from today into tomorrow. So our topics, basically, we've got these disruptions that are causing everything from the current state of what our environment has given us, and it's proven that our supply chain management is broken. So the lessons that we're learning right now from all of these shortcomings are going to be transformed to address future disruptions. That's what we're all about, is risk management. So regardless of the type of disruption, third-party risk management can be hard to start, hard to navigate, and hard to manage, but that's only until now. What I'm going to be sharing with you today are techniques, fundamentals, and components that you should be thinking about if you're not already, in efforts to get from where we used to work, how we used to do it, into the techniques and the efficiencies to make it so that it's not so painful. Sometimes third-party risk management and governance can be painful, and we want to take that pain away from you. So major components of today are going to be talking about transparency. So we want to expand the supply chain to forecast future disruptions. We want to talk about visibility, leveraging crowdsourced information and intelligence to understand potential weak points in our supply chain. Also, quickly adapting, taking our techniques and our fundamentals that we were using yesterday and today into what we should be using tomorrow, such as risk score changes, stratification techniques, tiering, assessment controls, and the adaptability for circumstances that are identified out of that. And then automation. A lot of companies are using different platforms or tools or solutions to just correlate and aggregate information that's needed. We're going to talk about automation to remove the clutter of what controls you should not be looking at to the controls you need to be looking at, workflow acceleration, and reporting. So what we know now, let's dig into that. Content gathering patience has grown thin. We've talked about this before in a couple other webinars, and many companies are looking at all these different types of standards that are out there. There's the Shared Information Gathering Questionnaire, there's the HISAC questionnaire, there's your proprietary questionnaire, there's all these different standards, and many companies are tired of gathering the content, and they'll come to you and they'll say, give me what you got. I'm going to give you my SIG and then take that as a compensating control while I fill out the HISAC questionnaire, or vice versa. And so that approach is going to soon be the new reality if it isn't already. Some companies might say, you know what, I'm going to push for the standard that's appropriate for me because I've set up my risk registers or my risk scoring and appetite to really be focused on maybe the prevalent control framework questionnaire. But in the meantime, if you have an engagement that needs to start right away and I need to look at what you do have, I will accept those questionnaires as a compensating control while you complete the proprietary and or the standard that I need you to fill out. So these questionnaire responses need to be automated, not only to include responses from the questionnaire, but also map the threat intelligence open source feed, because that pre-populated information from the outside in view gives you about 50% of the information that you need just by simply scanning for reality. We're going to see an increased focus on interconnections of the nth parties, so the fourth parties, the fifth parties, the sixth parties. What services are being provided? What products are being handled? What business dependencies do you have? And how you fulfill those business resiliency requirements. And then for 3 more other things, we'll look at increased application security. So we're finding through our exchanges and our networks, with the information that we have in our crowdsourcing, that software application and web development seems to be the weakest link on many of the industry levels. So we'll want to start looking more holistically into the SDLC process. Are they identifying static or dynamic code scans? And if that information is being adjusted to really focus on the high critical items or defect management areas versus the mediums and the lows. There's risk scoring models that are going to change because our risks for work from home is now becoming more to an uplifted risk that we need to look at. And tiering models might also change. We may not say that our tiers are going to completely adjust from the specific intelligence or the proprietary intelligence or the PHI, but we might add some risks to those in order to make sure that our tiering is appropriate. So as far as we know, the trust and verify approach is still at the forefront of our minds. But today, we can't physically travel to our third-party sites. Therefore, we're going to see this adoption of virtual assessments for those key and critical third parties that you need to do a deeper dive into. You'll still get a questionnaire for components such as policies and procedures. You're still going to run a threat intelligence report for open source intel. But in order to take that trust and verify and move into a validate area, you're going to have to start doing virtual assessments. And that shift is a fundamental shift. And there's going to be 3 phases to that journey in order to master the approach. And this is at least for those who are not already conducting virtual assessments today. They may already be doing that. And many companies are well into the immediate phase, and they've realized how to manage the risk virtually, and they've begun to document those assumptions and maybe even tested some of them out. So outside of the fundamentals that have changed, we've simply taken a look at validation techniques in the areas where companies have looked at things such as how to scope the virtual assessment. You don't need or want to perform a review or look to test protocols on everything that is asked or scanned in either a questionnaire or a threat intelligence report. You should have a list of key controls that are must-haves, and anything that has determined a risk. And in cases where threat intelligence is included, you'll want to confirm those risks are relevant. And then what you're going to do is, guess what? It's just going to become an item that you should virtually validate. Therefore, the scope is determined by the questionnaire, or both the questionnaire and the threat intelligence, and then you validate the risks that are identified. So as for vendor classification, the companies have most likely started to look at classification models to make sure their tiering approach still applies with the new remote work environment. Other things that will be modified include policy management. So you're going to start seeing companies that will take their TPRM programs and document exceptions to their current policy for third parties that are required on-site visits, but because of post-COVID, they can't do them. So they may require staff augmentation or services by region. They may hire offshore support services in the event that they must go on site. But those policies that they have today state that an on-site visit is required, and they'll have to change those policies with exceptions. And some of them won't want to do that right now because the protocol just keeps changing. We have an invisible monster that's coming at us as a pandemic, and sometimes we're having to work from home. Some companies are starting to go back to the office, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to travel in the future. So they might just put an exception process around their current policy. Secondly, exceptions or disposition handling is going to change. We're going to see periodic reviews of this for their policy, but some will be hesitant, like we just talked about. Thirdly, frequency of reviews are also going to adjust. It's going to be really important to make sure that whatever the scope of the virtual assessment is, it's fit for purpose for the engagement and the relationship. So in other words, companies are going to want to match their reviews to critical or high risk only. Some might even include medium risk companies, but the critical key point for this is that the scope must match the risk tolerance of your specific company. And that is why it's so important to help the customers understand what their must-have security controls are. And finally, corrective action requirements are going to need to be adjusted. So what this means is that the risk ratings that you have today, they're going to shift just a bit as well. So the TPRM teams are going to start looking at current outstanding risk items, and then they're going to reprioritize and start re-rating or re-ranking those risks, which may end up causing programs to identify that a risk you had yesterday might need to be closed because it's no longer a risk for tomorrow. And what you'll want to do is make sure that you have a platform that has the ability to bulk update and bulk close risks. Because could you imagine if you had risks that needed to be removed from your third-party portfolio, and let's pretend you had 5,000 vendors, and that one risk was identified as a risk yesterday, and now you need to close all of those and communicate it to your vendors that it's not a risk that they need to work on now, then you would want to have a platform that's going to allow you to be efficient with your time and with your updates to make sure that it's sophisticated enough to take the manual burden off of the TPRM resource manually going in and updating the risk for those 5,000 vendors. The automation and the bulk modify and the communication to your vendors is going to be key. So if we take a look at some of these immediate adaptations, the risk transparency is going enterprise-wide. It's making sure that you're not only looking at your fourth and your fifth and your nth party portfolios, but those are growing and they are no longer being ignored. The third party relationship is only the beginning, and some companies are struggling to even know who their third parties are or who the point of contacts for those third parties are, or how to find out their tiering approach if they're getting these spoon-fed lists to them from either multiple procurement departments or business units that may or may not be accountable for risk. We're also going to be looking at things that I've heard known as subportfolio categorization. And this is something that helps you to determine what type of categories by type needs to be looked at. And then the risk scoring methodology is going to change, like we talked about before. The questionnaires are evolving to really focus on the risks that we have today. And threat intelligence is expanding to its usage. You can take threat intelligence from the get-go to prioritize, but you also should be using it for continuous evaluation triggers. And you also should be using it to make sure that if there's a change in those types of scenarios, that you can act very responsively on the fact that there might be business intelligence that's telling you there's something changing with the business, and there might be cyber intelligence that's adjusting based on some open source intel feeds that tell us there's a weakness that needs to be mitigated. So if you look at that profile score, there's 4 major components: hosting providers, risk software, cloud services, and offshore, that are bubbling up to the top as the most important scores that need to be aggregated as the profile score or the stratification score. So then if you look into what we were doing in the past, we had these critical categories and there were multiple, up to 10, 20, 30, depending on what questionnaire standard you're using. And we're moving away from knowing everything to knowing very, very specific key controls. And what you're looking on the risk categories over to the right side is those things that are most important in our new threat landscape that we're experiencing today. At the very bottom of the wheel, you'll notice that access and connectivity with a red circle around it if you're able to see colors, but it's the bottom circle, and work from home is listed. A lot of our companies weren't working holistically from home. Now a lot of them are. And so we have to make sure that we're looking at the key risk components of work from home, how we're importing and making sure that our servers are up to par, our networks are locked down, our access controls are available to those who need it versus those who want it. And so with this transparency, you need to make sure that you have the visibility into what is critical. So many of the companies are looking to do this migration, and they are going with the approach of needing to know all controls to needing to know the key controls and the awareness and the management that needs to be applied to each engagement. Now, that doesn't mean that everything else is not important. If you ask a questionnaire or you're running threat intelligence and you get information that gives you everything under the sun risk knowledge, that's okay. But when you're doing an evaluation, it is an enormous, monstrous feat in order for you to have to go and look at every single risk. Some companies will say, we'll only look at high risks. Well, that was the approach of yesterday. Now the approach moving into tomorrow is, what are the key controls for our company that are most important and must-haves, and how do we address those first and foremost so that we know we're working with a company that also has the same position of maturity, and they're realizing that the data is being handled the same way, the connections are handled the same way, and we're not handing off work to someone who might be weaker in those areas. This helps with meaningful use. It will reduce your costs. It will make sure your resources are used for risk management instead of data collection, and it will help with processing as a whole. Now, if we look into the evolution of risk score. So scores have been used in multiple facets. You might be talking about FAIR and implementing that. You might also be talking about impact and likelihood, or qualitative and quantitative, all those buzzwords of things that we need to make sure that we're incorporating into our risk score methodology. There are things with scoring actions that you're going to see shifting in the future. And one of them is those questionnaire responses, inclusive of documentation reviews, maybe an SCA from shared assessment or a SOC 2 from the AICPA firms or any other security control document, along with threat intelligence report responses. And we'll talk a little bit more deeper dive into why threat intelligence is important and how to use it. But you'll see an uptick on software security assessments, maybe some things like the vendor building security and maturity models, and then response scores. Some companies are saying, look, if I send out a request for information from my third party, or if I'm including my fourth and fifth parties and they're not responding to me, that's an immediate risk. If they're unresponsive, then we need to make sure that we're also including that in our risk scores. And those components of any identified risks from the questionnaires, or risks from the documents, or risks from the threat intelligence, or the VB-SIM review, or the unresponsiveness risk is going to then aggregate into some risk score actions. The 1 to 2 being the most secure is you're going to want to have continuous evaluation. It doesn't mean it's shelfware where because they look so mature, we're just going to sit that on the shelf and look at it again in a year. You're going to want to use a platform that's going to trigger any change. So if any change real time happens, then you're going to want to see that content updated, and you're going to want to see the risk that gets applied, and you can continuously see if they still fall into that safe zone. The next one down is 2 to 3 kind of a risk score if you used a 1 to 5 scale. In between 2 and 3, you would want to have continuous evaluation of risk remediation, but that's going to be on action plans, because you're probably going back to the third party and saying, thank you so much for bringing your content to us for our evaluation. We have some risks that we need you to update in our key control security posture. Here are the things that we're going to assign to you, and we're going to track those risks to closure. When they have those risks, you're going to want to know that they've been mitigated real time, and you're going to want to review that once it gets to you, because their risk is going to change live. It shouldn't be in a year, I'm going to go look to make sure they fixed it, because some of these management plans could be 3 months. Some of them can be or take a year, but you want it real time. Anything that's from the 3 to 4 scale is going to be a mandatory annual comprehensive evaluation. And what that means is that because they were very weak in their security posture, you might be doing more due diligence with them from a perspective of, I need to keep a closer eye on you, so I'm going to make sure no matter what I'm getting on a continuous evaluation approach, I'm going to do a deep dive evaluation on you to really hone in on the items that I need to help you with your security posture so that you're up to par with our company or our industry. And then when anything falls into the 4 or 5 range, you might want to start thinking about identifying a more secure vendor for that service or product. Because if they are that weak and you don't have the bench strength to help them uplift their security maturity, it might behoove you to go and look for someone that might give you more of a security stability by doing business with them. Now, if we look at the indicator triggers, these could be environmental, or they also could be an industry event. So if a security incident comes up, that's going to trigger you to reevaluate that particular third party. If a high-risk vulnerability announcement comes out from either your ISAC or ISAO or a community consortium that tells you, hey, there's something going on with this particular vendor or a vulnerability, you're going to want to be able to go to the platform and say, how many of my third parties have this vulnerability, and really quickly go out from an incident response perspective and ask them or proactively get them to tell you how they're addressing those vulnerabilities. There are going to be new controls and compliance requirements, especially from what we're living in today. So you want to be able to have the agility and adaptability and flexibility. Wow, those are a bunch of words with lilies in them. But we want to take that information really quickly and ask our third parties to respond to how they are being compliant without having to wait a whole year to do that. The tactics and the techniques, things like we're talking about right now, that intelligence needs to be applicable in your platform. You need to make sure that you've got practices and controls that are leading, not lagging. There are a lot of times that we look at regulations and frameworks and we say, okay, this is what we have to do. But we need to see proactive information to know what to do before the regulation comes in play. Because if you listen to some of the webinars or some of the educational series about how long it takes for a regulatory requirement to come out, it might be too late for you. And we don't want that to happen. We want to be proactive. There's going to be changes in vulnerability posture, even though someone looks safe now or is presenting in their intelligence reports that they are in a safe security posture or business posture. It might change. They might change from a breach that occurred, or they changed, they were a merger and acquisition. So look at those things as well. Don't just allow things to shift and change without taking a look-see into it. And then changing the service and product availability, that also can occur. You might have an engagement with a third party that's doing one type of service and they offer additional ones. Well, once they start offering those additional ones to your company, you're going to have to reevaluate that third party to make sure that they've got controls wrapped around that service and or product as well. So let's talk about We always used to refer to webinars and informing people of strategies and practices as TPRM or TPRG best practices. And we need to start moving that towards an enterprise risk-based fundamental discussion, because best practices are what you did in the past. Fundamentals that are risk-based driven are what you're going to do in the future. So as we're emerging stronger, you want to be able to scale with quality. And this is placing a focus on making sure that you're using not only your assessment questionnaire content, but also threat intelligence monitoring and coupling those two together. Because by doing that, you're going to be able to see the inside out and the outside in view of risk. Say, for example, I am a third party and a company has asked me to complete a questionnaire. So I complete the questionnaire and they are gloriously shown what my risks are using the platform. And then they say, okay, your risk is by what you've told me, here are your risks. But then they run a threat intelligence report, and that threat intelligence report brings insight of what's happening in the outside. And it's reflecting that I might have said that I had a security control or a key control that was up to par, but the threat intel is saying, maybe not so much. So that's going to end up being something that gets normalized, and it will identify that there really is a risk, not just by what I'm telling them I'm doing versus what the outside world is seeing I am doing. And that analytics can then end up becoming what we need for our remediation actions. So having that workflow and a playbook for the automation and bringing those two components together is important. And we'll also talk today about not only with assessments of trust and monitoring as verify, but also what do you do if you have to validate with those on-site assessments going away and the virtual assessments coming into play. So jumping into entity profiling, or what you can call this is entity stratification. There are comprehensive stratification requirements, including risk and compliance and context. And these are the three things that you need to see in a single pane of glass or a single dashboard. And what that will do will give you is a rapid vendor risk awareness, but also it will show the internal business units what decisions need to be made. And that is where we've all been waiting for this. And this is where we need to be going. So many companies are using multiple solutions and sources, and they're attempting to use APIs to gather that content and correlate that content together into a hub of some sort. However, what happens in those situations when you're using multiple different software programs and products and platforms is it won't always provide you the holistic picture unless you've got the ability to aggregate the risk scoring and then cohesively put that into a report to the nth degree. And that's not a pun. It's for not only your third parties, but it's also for your nth parties. So you're going to need to look at using solutions that can aggregate the intelligence from outside and inside and all the ongoing activity triggers to gain an accurate pulse on your risk. So stratifying that data, like I said, otherwise referred to as profiling or scoping, should be imported from your source intelligence and or connected by system integrations using APIs. But without it, you're required to piece the puzzle together during the assessment review, and the reports will be only a portion of the risk picture, or you have to try to correlate that in a manual aspect. So make sure you're looking for a platform that does all of that for you. The assessment insights is important as well. So we talked a little bit about you've got assessments that drive the automation risk, and that gives you the insight into your policies and your processes. Then you've got the proactive assessments that allow regular information gathering, including event management. And then you have another assessment insight that can reflect both the intelligence and the vendor assessment using automation, which is where you want to get. So using a platform that has an appropriate type of a scheduler that launches all of the packages of information you need to know by relevance. So say, for example, you have a tier 1 and they need your most comprehensive questionnaire, your most comprehensive intelligence report, and some of those may need a validated virtual assessment. So you're going to want to package that together in order to use that approach. But then you may have some low risk assessments, and they may only need to have a portion of that comprehensive questionnaire, a very limited scope in the threat intelligence, and then they won't require a validation virtual assessment. So you'll want to work on how your tiering approach and what you're applying those packages of content gathering looks like, and then using either exchanges or networks of already completed intelligence. Having the ability to absorb that information rapidly is going to get you to par up into your tiering approach. Now, in the inherent and residual risk, there are many companies that will say, okay, I'm going to give you the inherent risk, and then once you get the responses back, then we'll identify your residual risk. Make sure you're using a platform that when you're stratifying, profiling, or scoping or tiering your third parties, just by the fact that you're working with that third party and that limited questionnaire for the stratification is going to be able to tell you what your inherent risk is. Then use a platform that you have pre-configured your risk appetite and also risk recommendations, so that when you ask them to fill out a more comprehensive questionnaire, whether at the same time as your stratification or after, that information is going to come to you and magically show you what the risks are for identifying which ones are real to you, and those become your residual risk. Now, for self-reporting, we've got event reporting that can happen from threat intelligence, but we also need to manage the mitigation of the threat intelligence and the questionnaire responses together. So again, if I was the vendor and I answered my questionnaire that said I am healthy in this security control, but yet the threat intelligence is proving differently, that adjusts, it informs me as a vendor to fix, and then I tell you when I have it fixed, and then you can verify if it's fixed, or if I'm a critical vendor, validate that it's been fixed. So these are the assessment insights that you want to make sure your platform has. Now, knowing what third parties you have and what may be a standard questionnaire that you're using, many standard questionnaires will ask the same question in different sections of the questionnaire. So you might be asking the same question. This might be a bad example, but I'll just use it for deferring. Here's a bucket and here's another bucket. You might be asking a question in your third party security section that also intercorrelates with your cloud. And if that's the case, you don't want the third party to have to answer the question twice, or if they do answer something and it's written differently, but it shows as a compensating control, you want to see that as rapidly as possible. So go with the platform that's going to be able to show you a holistic view of your questionnaire with related questions and or threat intelligence information, so that you could say, okay, they answered it this way in this section, but look over here, this is answered this way, or the threat intelligence is showing me something. So those are compensating controls which will mitigate that risk, and that will be helpful so that you're not having them fix something that may be reflected somewhere else in their responses as a safe and or weak security point. So this type of a feature within a platform is going to show the risk relationships and provide a clear, easy way of seeing the associations, and it will enable you to link the items to one another. And then once those relationships between risks have been determined, if a vendor triggers one or both of those risk items in the response to a submission, the relationship between the two risk items will generate and be displayed. So that's kind of giving you a spider diagram or a list diagram of everything that matches and maps together. Now, from a continuous monitoring perspective, we need to make sure we're talking about this in the same terminology. There's continuous monitoring, which is threat intelligence. And then some people refer to continuous assessments and continuous evaluation as the act of monitoring or risk managing all of the risks that have happened and are being closed. So our continuous monitoring report has already interlinked with the third-party questionnaires so that you can see if one of the question responses have come back, whereas the intelligence is telling you differently, and it's going to give you action where the risks are created. It will provide tasks for people to follow up, whether it be the vendor or your internal business unit, and it will populate flags to show you that there's something to look at. These reports can be in a PDF capability for your executives if you need to get it out to other resources, and it's digestible. It's in a format where you don't have to train your executives on what are they looking at. The other thing is the contextual mapping of the risk relationships. It's going to correlate those results, and it's going to help you in identifying compliance findings. Now, if you look at the risk ecosystem, I'm jumping around just a bit. So we're going to kind of focus in on what are the future things that are coming from a platform and from a program perspective that already are available to you in efforts to get over the hump of, I've been doing collection, I've been doing assessments or evaluations, but I'm not able to see for business resiliency what's being impacted by the hard work and the painful work that I've been going through in step 1 and step 2. So if we simply begin with knowing the third-party ecosystem, we can evaluate the key risk indicators, and that fosters what we call risk-based decisions. But the challenge is that some of us can't even look at our nth party span of risk because most of our companies, as we've talked about before, don't even know their third-party universe, let alone the companies that have been contracted or subcontracted by them for support. So transparency being one of the critical items to identify risk-based decisions. If you don't know the interconnections of companies, then you're going to have a challenge in understanding the risk of doing business with them or who they're subcontracting. So take a look at the spider diagram in the slide. It's kind of tiny, or if you have a big screen, good for you. You can see that it's going to tell you how to harmonize those interconnections. I call this diagram the supply chain management database. I've used this slide in a couple webinars before, and some people use the terminology of third-party management database. But when you look at this, you need the ability to see how data is flowing, in what direction, and to why and whom. So what department is using the engagement service or product. With this, you're able to view what departments and companies are supported by the relationship. You can see the governance requirements and the connections, as well as the applications and the services, and much, much more. So now in real life on a platform, you are able to identify the impact based on a vulnerability, an environmental situation, a breach, and immediately you're going to know what businesses and companies would be impacted, so you can quickly invoke your business resiliency planning or crisis management. Now, the reason why everyone hasn't moved to this direction is because it's hard to do. So if you don't have a solution or a platform that's going to help you gather this information and reflect it in a landscape navigatory, I don't know if navigatory is a word, I make up new ones, but we'll say landscape navigation map. And that's going to be how your relationships internally and externally can cause impact. Also, an important thing is to see the risk landscape in reality through the relationships of the diagram. So you could have a swift capability to track and manage those risk mitigation plans. And in my quest to assist TPRM program maturity, the first thing I recommend is to know your third-party universe. And that can be hard. If you have even a half list of your third parties, don't go through analysis paralysis by trying to get the entire universe list. Take the approach of, here's what I know, let's start working on those, and anything new that comes into the program, we'll go ahead and assess them as well using these efficiencies. But I'm also going to, in the background, start working on list of third parties that have point of contacts, list of third parties that have internal business unit accountability, and then lists of third parties that I can go and look up the URL and run threat intelligence reports. So if you work on those three things at the same time, then you're going to have the ability to get a very fast return on investment with a platform that can support you doing that. Make sure you're assessing by relevance. We talked about that already, where don't ask them everything under the sun unless that's a critical third party that needs to give you that information. But most importantly, identify and track your risks by using a risk management program that you can configure into the platform that's going to say, here by tier, I want to use the same or maybe different questionnaires. And based on their responses, this is the risk that is applied, and this is the recommendation that I ask them to complete. Because if you're not tracking and managing the risk, why on earth are you assessing the third party? And if you are assessing them or evaluating them, do it at the right fit for purpose. And as for outside in threat monitoring, the most important criteria to consider is context and relevance of the information you're receiving. Some of you may have already been on some of my webinars, and I'm going to use the same analogy because I love it. But because I like it so well, I'm going to tell those of you who have not heard it. So imagine if you are a multitude of content displayed on a threat intelligence report, and what that equates to is a bowl of colored candy, like M&Ms. So out of the whole entire bowl of M&Ms, or risks identified on the report, there might be 2 orange candies that represents IP issues, and there might be 1 green candy representing a TLS issue, or 3 blue candies which represent some business intelligence issues. And the 2 orange and the 1 green and the 3 blue candies in that entire bowl of M&Ms is all I care about. So how am I going to find that in a bowl of M&Ms? Or how am I going to find that information that matters to me in the engagement in the entire risk report from the intelligence? Basically, you're going to want to make sure that you're not greedy and wanting to look at everything, but you segregate what's important. Look at what's consequential to your relationship, pre-configure your report to show you what's critical, and focus on those risks that matter most in the engagement with that third party and even your nth parties. Set up the notifications to change to alert you to drive decisions based on that trigger, and that will set you up for a more appetizing approach to not just looking at the entire noise of what could be going on in the open source intelligence, but to what's really specific to you. And do remember that threat intelligence gives you approximately 50% of the security control awareness that you need to know when either using it to properly do due diligence or track the time for your supply chain health. So calibration of the context is key when using threat intelligence, and you should be using both a questionnaire, document review, and threat intelligence even before you go into any type of validation steps that you might want to do for your critical third parties. A lot of companies only have a staff of 2 people, and then some companies have a staff of more. We've found that there are risk assessment services that help third parties get through a collection phase and a verification phase, and in some cases, a validation and or risk management phase in much more rapid pace than any other type of scenario. So if you're using spreadsheets, I pray for your health because spreadsheets are hard to use. I hope that you are able to get to a scenario where you can use platforms or a solution that will give you information that's already readily available, and or have a workflow and chaser emails that can help collect that information for you, either using a risk operations center service or having it so that it's so automated for you that it makes it more streamlined. What you're seeing in front of you is an example of a light questionnaire of maybe 47 key controls and a full questionnaire of about 217 security controls, which have also the 47 key controls in it. And it shows how long it takes to collect if the person's not on vacation, how long it takes to verify that the responses are giving you what you are asking. Sometimes if you ask for documentation, you want to check to make sure it's not a picture of someone's family pet, since we now work with them so closely. But those are the things that you want to look for, and then that it's the right duration or age of report. So maybe you aren't accepting anything that's less than a year old. And then it gets into a network or an exchange or into your visibility. And that would take at least 15 days for the light questionnaire, 22 days for a full at an average. Then you want to communicate. A lot of companies will do an assessment on a vendor and they won't provide the vendor the results. And that's the most important key point. Thank you for giving me your information. Here's what I need you to fix. I'm not only going to share it with you, but I'm escalating it if I am required to executives. But this is going to give them at least their high risks or their medium risks or their entire risk portfolio of doing business with you. And do imagine that a vendor could be receiving risk reports differently from different organizations that they have an engagement with, because the risk tolerance at one company may not be the risk tolerance at the next. So the vendor is going to have to decide how they're going to fix those risks to the most highest security standard of whatever engagements they have. Now moving on to the virtual validation. So turning us back a quick moment, I wanted to make sure that I provided to you a diagram of the components that programs are going to adapt to meet the new expectations to manage these virtual assessments or validations. And for companies that are challenged with planning this, preparation is the key, because if they don't prepare, they're going to be faced with struggles to adopt this approach. The questionnaires, for one, are going to have a new focus on things such as what questions are really relevant, what questions are being asked today that need to be asked now because of the new risk landscape that maybe weren't asked before. If the tiers have changed, how will the assessment be adjusted, and how are they going to recommunicate that back to the third party that the risk is either a new risk because of our environment or an existing risk that we're closing, so that they're not doing work on something that's no longer a high risk. And how to apply those questionnaires to an existing or a new third party moving forward is going to be important. Now, if we move into scoping, the virtual assessment is going to be using at least 4 scoping parameters. One is the trust portion. That's where the questionnaire is going to help narrow down the risk domains that require verification. And notice I didn't say validation, because validation is an effort to test the controls to make sure they're effective and enforced. Verification is when you just confirm that the information that you've received from a questionnaire or threat intelligence is real and applicable to your engagement. The one great feature of an automated platform is the fact that the relevant risk control domains can be pre-configured to make sure that the engagement is applying that content gathering and risk identification based on the service or the product that's being provided to your company. There's going to be new controls that are created due to the virtual environment, work from home, etc. And that's going to be included in scope, and it's going to flex based on the waves of the different work from home scenarios we're experiencing. There's also going to be some cases where full assessments will be required. However, that should be a very minimal critical subset of the third-party portfolio. So you have to make sure that meaningful use of engagement assessments and evaluations is being applied. And oh, let's not forget, we recently discussed the glorious spider diagram on the previous slide of the supply chain management database, where this should have content including subcontractor relationships. So a lot of us, don't be scared. We're not looking at fourth parties because we don't even know our third parties yet, but we'll get you there. So documentation and artifact sharing, let's move into that pillar. As we know, we have stipulations specific at each company as to what is shareable and what is not. One company might say, I can show you my documentation. The other ones are going to say, I'm not allowed to put that up on a portal. I'm not allowed to share it unless it's a clean room. So each customer that uses a platform is going to need to know the rules of the virtual documentation sharing and review that with their third party and set up how they're going to conduct the virtual assessment by the rules being followed. Planning is something that is important, we talked about, because without it, it's going to be a huge challenge. All sorts of things can go wrong. The virtual experience could be painful for both your solution provider and or your third party. And the company is going to need to have a template. So you're going to want to give them a template of what the expectations are prior to scheduling the assessment. And a simple project management skill uptick is going to be required to the resources that do that, because in efforts to plan, set up the meetings, know the right people, the subject matter experts, that's an important step. And this is all about expectation settings on both sides of the house. Now, if we look at collaboration with your TPRM platform, this is one of the greatest assets and features of a platform that you can have. Because when a company is required to look at how screen sharing will occur and how companies can utilize the information, you don't want to have to extract information and put it into an area. You want to use the platform of where it's all stored and then create role-based access rights for the assessors and the assessed. So that's going to be paramount. The risk management should be basically our middle name for everybody on this webinar, because that's what we do. We help our customers find the risk. We make sure it is a true risk. We place a plan of action to mitigate it. We then track it to closure. We inform the business on how safe or unsafe the company is to do business with, and the third parties or the fourth parties. And I am extremely encouraged and excited about offerings and platforms that can now accomplish all of this and more with ease. So now let's look at key takeaways. I want to make sure that you take away key things, and we have some time for some questions and answers. This next slide isn't eye color sore or chart or thorough, whatever way you want to say it. But what I'm sharing with you is something that I use whenever I'm helping a company strategize on how to build their program, what the key performance indicators are, what the key risk indicators are, and how to use a platform and intelligence the right way to drive you to a holistic view and approach. So you're not going to get a deep dive into this today, but if you would like to have a discussion, you can email info@prevalent.net. Tell them that you saw this webinar and that you want to have a discussion with me. And I absolutely enjoy talking about the program maturation and would be happy to talk to those that are like-minded. They'll get that email over to me. You will receive access of this slide deck, so you'll have a copy of this placemat to further absorb, but I wanted to make sure you're aware of the ability to discuss it as well. We have the ability to conduct maturity assessments, and I'm hoping that you're all looking at making sure that you can represent what you're doing well today, even if you're just starting out, so that you can then get a report back that will share with you exactly where the areas are that you could get the biggest bang for your ROI or buck. So say, for example, you might be a little bit weak on your content gathering, or you might have some remediation risk maturities that you might want to put in place. We have the ability of doing and performing a 1-hour maturity assessment that we can give you a report that will share with you things that you can improve upon. And as you go into the next couple quarters or year, you would know what things you could work on. And we've done it over 10 handfuls or 3 handfuls of resources and companies, and they've used it for executives to ask for funding. They've also used it to show the great work that they've done from the infancy of their program into whatever maturity level they have. We're going to be moving from static point-in-time assessments that are manually using spreadsheets with a siloed approach to intelligence, which is ad hoc and rigid, to a very proactive type of third-party risk management where it's dynamic and real-time and automated and integrated and agile and flexible and adaptable. So when you look at this, you want to make sure that you identify with your maturity assessment where you are and making it so that we're getting you to a continuous intelligence that's automated versus all of the other steps that in the maturity you have to take. I've seen companies rapidly grow into this within 6 to 7 months. And I've seen companies that have taken 3 years. It really is all about how you proactively define how you want to address it. Now, knowing that we have a pain doing this and we've got informed information that can be given to you and the adaptability to grow, here are many of the areas that you need to be looking at in order to manage your vendors in one place and get out of spreadsheet jail. I love that terminology. Become smarter, working smarter, not harder, fixing what's really important and being extremely proactive. So these things are the items and areas that you're going to want to work on holistically moving forward. Now, the intelligence from every corner, this is the end goal to emerge stronger. It's to enable more informed, intelligence-driven decisions. Today, solutions include inputs from a large number of resources like ours, and we want to make sure that you're getting what you need from all of what we have now and what's coming in our next releases. So if you're regulatory monitoring or there's technology integrations with different GRCs and threat intelligence, there's also vendor communities that we're working with and private sources that are bringing in, along with business and breach monitoring of over 200,000 sources. This is how we're going to get you to a proactive state. And then finally, if you want to find out more on how Prevalent can help, you can receive faster ROI, obtain better insights, increase your scalability, get third-party risk management and governance expertise to help you build your program, mature towards predictability, and ultimately reduce your headaches from all the manual labor required to collect and analyze to actually having risk-based results. Prevalent's ready to help, and so am I. So with that, we have limited time for questions, but I'll hand it over for a polling item that we have for Peter. And any questions that we will make sure we get back out to you for answers.
Thanks, Brenda. So we do have a couple questions that are in the queue. We'll see if we have time to get to more than one. But in the meantime, I've launched a poll. So if you don't mind taking that quick poll question, and it says, for those of you who can't see it, sometimes on different platforms, folks have trouble seeing it. Are you looking to augment or establish a third-party risk program this year? So yes, no, or you're not sure. So the question that I think we'll start with here in the queue is, and I'm not sure if you've got any stats around this, so apologize in advance if it's a bad question for you, but it did come in. So what is the estimated average time to value for contracted product service delivered by a vendor for low, medium, and high risk vendor assessment leveraging the framework you have outlined? So a little wordy, but hopefully you understood that question.
Okay, I might be taking this out of context, and if I am, please respond in the question or chat so that I can get to the right one. But if you're talking about how long does it take for a high questionnaire to come back, a medium questionnaire, and a low, the low questionnaires, if the questions are to a very limited key control approach, can come back within a week. That gives you risk right away. If it's a medium and your questionnaires are within the span of about 100 or less questions, or maybe 120 questions, you can also see that within a week. And then the larger questionnaires are more comprehensive. Those can be 2 weeks, but the only way to make that happen is to have automated email chasers so that you're not having to manage the turnaround time for everything to come back. It will tell them, hey, you have this amount of time to get this finished, or did you forget, or something to that effect. So hopefully that answered your question, but if I took that out of context, please let me know.
It looks like that did answer the question, so we did get a comment back, so that's perfect. Thank you. Looks like we're almost at the top of the hour, so I don't want to run into anyone's next meeting. So I think we'll wrap it up here, but thank you so much, Brenda. And a reminder that this was being recorded. We will send a link to that recording out early tomorrow morning, and we will wrap up these slides in a link and also send that to you guys as well. So thank you so much, and I'm going to end the polling. Thank you so much for attending, and Brenda, thank you for your time and excellent presentation.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Have a great day. Stay healthy and safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.